Welcome to the Simmons School of Library and Information Science and the 10th Annual Ellen Smith Symposium. I am Sanda Erdeles and I'm the Director of SLIS. We are very pleased to have Dr. Safiya Noble here with us today. The theme for the symposium this year is Innovation and Equity, Technology, Ethics, and the Future of Library and Information Science. This event would not be possible without the support of the late Professor Ellen Smith, who was a beloved faculty member at Simmons SLIS for 31 years. While this is a virtual event, Simmons SLIS recognizes the land on which we work and study is the rightful heritage of peoples known, including the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Pacomptuck, and Nipmuc peoples, as well as peoples unknown to us. We gratefully respect not only their attachment and claim to the land, but the centuries of stewardship which allows us and our institution to prosper here. As grateful but uninvited guests on this land, we will continue to work to be accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Today's conversation with Dr. Noble will be moderated by Dr. Marie Desjardins, the Dean of the Simmons University College of Organizational, Computational, and Information Sciences. Dr. Desjardins' research is in artificial intelligence, focusing on the areas of machine learning, multi-agent systems, planning, interactive artificial intelligence techniques, information management, reasoning with uncertainty, and decision theory. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University with a Bachelor of Arts in Engineering and Computer Science and earned her PhD in Computer Science from the University of California at Berkeley. Hello, Marie.
Thank you, Sanda. And I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Safiya Noble. If you want to join me on screen, good morning. Or I guess it's good afternoon now. Dr. Noble is an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, in the Department of Information Studies, where she serves as the co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Under her leadership, C2I2 has also recently begun a partnership with the Art12 Foundation. Dr. Noble's academic research focuses on the design of digital media platforms on the internet and their impact on society. Her work is both sociological and interdisciplinary, marking the ways that digital media impacts and intersects with issues of race, culture, gender, and technology. Dr. Noble holds appointments in African American Studies and Gender Studies. She is active with a number of initiatives, including the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, serving those vulnerable to online harassment, and the NYU Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies Advisory Board. Dr. Noble is also the author of a best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines entitled Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism by NYU Press. And if you haven't read this book, I encourage all of the audience to get it and read it. It's really insightful and tells us a lot about important trends in information and technology use today. So we have a series of questions that will guide our conversation, and then we'll open it up for the audience to share their questions, which you can put in to the panelists using the chat window. So our first couple of questions are related to your book, Dr. Noble, Algorithms of Oppression. So could you talk a little bit about algorithmic bias, why it's such a critical issue, and what its impact on specific identities is, and how your work has focused on these issues?
Sure. And thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with you today. And so grateful to SLIS and my colleagues, Rachel Williams and Colin Rainsmith, whose work I admire so much. And I'm so grateful for all the work that everyone put into bringing me today. I'll just say that, this idea of algorithmic bias at the time that I started doing this work, I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the information school there. And, the primary way in which people were thinking about algorithmic bias at that time was really to be thinking kind of in the political economy of technology platforms, whether it was kind of the way in which new Web 2.0 environments were becoming what uh, um, we think of it, Mark Andreevich writes about as kind of digital enclosures, where the things that we see are so tightly controlled by different kinds of algorithms and their commercial interests. Siva Vaidyanathan had written this incredible book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. And it was really about what does it mean when large-scale multinational companies like Google control the information environment and what that was putting at stake. Of course, that book came out at the height of the Google Book digitization project, where academic libraries all over Europe and the United States had gotten excited about handing over millions of volumes to Google to digitize, only to do a 180 a few years later and realize maybe that was a terrible idea to hand over all of these cultural heritage works and other kinds of works to the public. Of course, that also got impeded by lawsuits against Google. And so, the way we were thinking about algorithmic bias then was mostly around the kind of commercial interests of large scale technology companies and the way in which they prioritized their own commercial interests. And of course, here I'm thinking of the people like Helen Niesenbaum at NYU. I think she might be at Cornell now, and Lucas Centrona. And they were writing about like how Google prioritizes its own interests above other kinds of competitors. But in all of that, I was thinking about how these are particular kinds of biases that are, of course, around kind of capital and commercial interests and the profit imperative, but they had differential kinds of effects on minoritized communities. And that what I found as I started looking at the way in which culture and heritage and identity was captured in something like a search engine, and really, I could have done this around Facebook too, but I was mostly interested in search at the time, was that it had much more kind of egregious, harmful impact. And so this is where I was kind of arguing that there's really kind of a racist and sexist discriminatory effect of algorithms. And, at the time, 10 years ago, to say that algorithms could be racist was just like a ludicrous proposition. Professor Ryan-Smith can tell you what it was like. He was there witnessing when we were at Illinois, how many professors, for example, would just say that it's impossible for there to be racist or sexist discrimination at the level of the algorithm. They kind of always thought of this as being like user error or some other type of problem. Because, this idea was that algorithms were just math and math can't be racist or math can't be sexist. I mean, that really was a prevailing logic 10 years ago. And, now, of course, there's been nothing but just, mountains of evidence over the last decade that have come to the fore, where we understand truly the ways in which these kinds of technologies can be profoundly discriminatory. And so, the book is a way to kind of put a stake in that, these arguments, and to try to lay out in a, kind of careful case study of both Google and Yelp, how that's happened.
So could you share a few highlights from the book itself? And it's also been a couple of years since the book was published, and things change so fast. So are there sort of key things that you maybe would have included in the book if you were writing it now? What are the changes that have happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, with respect to Google search, not a lot has changed fundamentally in the logics. So I think this book is going to hold up for a little while, because search would have to, commercial search, the way we know it as an advertising, multinational advertising platform, would have to radically alter its entire structure. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. So I think the examples change over time. So one of the things, for example, that is probably the most notable thing that people remember if they were exposed to my work was these kind of early searches on what happens when you look for Black girls or Latina girls or Asian girls. We search on those keywords. And what happened a decade ago was you found almost exclusively pornography representing these identities of women and girls of color. And so, since then, Google's really taken my book like just a big book of tickets and fixed the tickets. That's tech speak for anyone who's not a technologist or hasn't worked in a tech company. When you work in a tech company or you work on technology, we're really interested in documenting a problem or like where code breaks. And so we often will open up a ticket, which means we're opening up documentation of the problem. And then we're documenting how we changed or resolved the problem and then closing the ticket. And then it lives, if you're a better technologist than most, it lives in a place where other people, when that problem happens again or that something breaks, you can refer back to old tickets to sort it out. So, I know that my book was like a big book of tickets, and they fixed a lot of things. They downranked a lot of pornography, of course, with different updates to the search algorithms. They will often try to figure out, what the latest efforts have been to game their algorithms by, gray market search engine optimization companies and this kind of thing. And they'll try to create ways to kind of band-aid solve some of those problems. But, there's many, many, many new examples. One of the examples in the book that I gave is what happened when Kabir Ali, a teenager from Baltimore, was doing a search on 3 Black teenagers. And what he found were all these kind of criminal mugshots in Google image search that represented Black teenagers. And then he said, let's see what happens when we change one word, Black to white. And when he did 3 white teenagers, it was all these like perfectly curated Getty images of white teenagers. And that was a story, that was a fix. Google like solved and attempted to solve what happened there. But of course, just last summer, someone on Twitter, for the first time ever, Googled 4 Black teenagers and got the exact same thing. So, the logics of what I'm saying don't change. They just changed the number and got the same kind of scenario. So this is what I mean, that, new evidence of the same old thing, persists. In a variety of different kinds of Google products.
And I guess that's really the question is, are these things being not addressed at all, which would be the worst, addressed but only kind of incrementally and locally, or addressed in a systemic way of actually stepping back and looking at the infrastructure and the technology and where the data is coming from and how it's being used? And those are such harder questions, and it takes a lot more work to get in there and identify those sources. Could you talk some about the Art12 Foundation and how you're working with them and what are the goals for that work?
Sure. This was an interesting kind of relationship. It probably wouldn't have been one that would have ever crossed my radar or my collaborator, Sarah Roberts at UCLA. But, I got this email out of the blue one day. This is kind of a funny story. And, it was like the Duke and Duchess of Sussex would like to meet with you. And I thought it was kind of like a scam email, that was going to be followed by please Western Union, some money or send your bank account, it just had it didn't make sense. I was like, what is this? And, a couple of days later, while I was trying to figure out what and why, and if this was even legitimate. I was on Twitter and I saw, and anybody who knows me knows that my second job is being on Twitter. I Someone tweeted at me that the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, had shared my book in a People magazine article with Gloria Steinem. And someone tweeted it at me. And I was like, what in the world is going on? I mean, it just was too ludicrous. But it turns out that, kind of in a long story short, that, Meghan Markle was the most trolled. She's kind of generally considered the most trolled person of 2019. And she's been driven off of social media by the incredible racist vitriol that has come her way since she started dating a prince, Prince Harry, who is now her husband. And I think, in fact, my former dean, when I was visiting USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, Willow Bay, gave Meghan my book because she knew that Meghan was really concerned about the kind of harm that's on the internet and the way it's kind of specifically racist and sexist and terrible. And she thought, oh, maybe Meghan will like Safiya's book, and, didn't really think anything of it. And it turns out Meghan really loved the book, and so did Harry. And so they did actually send a real email and asked if they could be of support to amplifying the both my work and the work of the center in focusing on people who are vulnerable. And the thing about the two of them, of course, is that I think they have an incredible amount of power and privilege to be insulated from harm, but they deeply empathize with people who would never be able to insulate themselves from the damage of trolling or reputation destroying, of racism and sexism, of cyber stalking, of pornography, revenge porn or non-consensual pornography, which also has happened to Meghan. And they really identify with people who will never be able to protect themselves from that, because in their own, I think, incredible bubble of privilege, it was soul destroying for them. And so they want to help amplify our work to intervene upon those kinds of things. And that's really that's it. I mean, it's kind of simple. It's not much more spectacular than, like many people who support our work, they know we care about people who are incredibly vulnerable and whose rights don't exist in many of these kinds of internet spaces, and for whom those harms are not contained to social media, but are part of their lives, their everyday lives. And that's how we're working together. Mostly we're sharing people to read and things that they should know about and they're just learning, and we're trying to help teach.
So can you talk a little more about the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry more broadly, and the kinds of work you're doing? One thing you're doing, and you've done with the book and you do with all of your work, is to raise awareness of these issues, because you can't fix something that you can't see, and people
Right.
don't. What are some of the next steps, and what are some of the kinds of things that you're trying to accomplish through the center?
Well, the most important thing I think that we think of for our work is really amplifying other people's work. So we have our work, Sarah and I. Sarah, her work is, she did the first large-scale academic study of commercial content moderators, people who moderate content for large-scale internet companies. That's actually a term she coined, commercial content moderation. And of course, her work focuses on people who are vulnerable, the workers who do this type of incredibly psychologically, neurologically, emotionally damaging work, physically damaging work in the way that is just so such a degrading kind of labor. And we also, we have this very robust Scholars Council and we have all of these scholars up at our website at c2i2.ucla.edu. You can look there for our Scholars Council. We really try to amplify those people's work too, because those are people who we are constantly learning from, people who care about, again, not prioritizing the tech, but prioritizing communities and people who are trying to intervene upon harms, whether it's the work of people like Professor Ryan Smith working on, addressing people who are digitally divided and for whom they are outside of many kinds of large-scale computing ecosystems, and enfranchising people around their access to knowledge and information, or people like, Professor Simone Brown at UT Austin, who work on, histories of anti-Black racist surveillance, and how analog surveillance systems get reimagined into digital surveillance systems of control and power. So it's a broad range of people that we really are trying to convene. So we are hosting convenings around different kinds of issues. We've hosted convenings that have helped inform, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on Race, Racism, and Xenophobia, Tendai Echeme, who's a UCLA Law School professor, bringing together people we think of as the world's experts at the intersection of race and technology so that they can help educate her for her work with the United Nations and helping the United Nations to intervene on some of this. We are often called upon by policymakers, legislators, regulators, people who want expert testimony. And so we do a lot of that kind of work. And, we think about, because we're in LA and we can't help it, we think about culture shifting. And so, we've just brought on our first artist in residence, who is a Black woman filmmaker who is absolutely incredible, Ogi Ibono, who made her directorial debut in 2020 with this incredible film called Invisible Portraits that's about intersectionality and the power and resilience of Black women. And so, her expertise in helping us storytell the kinds of harms are really, really important. And so kind of that's the agenda.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I want to switch gears a little bit with technology. Your book is largely about search, and we talked about information access. My background is in machine learning, and there's a whole, that industry is growing massively. And I know you gave a talk recently at UMass Amherst about AI in university admissions systems. One of the things that I like to point out when I talk about bias and racism in machine learning algorithms is that machine learning algorithms inherently have to have bias. That's how they work. They have to have some kind of bias in them, because that's how they go from data to discovering patterns to making predictions. So how do we identify and articulate the different sources of bias and ensure that we're building systems with the kinds of biases that we actually want to have, which is the patterns that we're looking for, without building in structural racism and exacerbating existing biases in those systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. And one of the things that, of course, is, I'm challenged often to help my colleagues in machine learning and AI, for example, understand is that the way in which oftentimes engineers think about bias is depoliticized, right? And so this is one of the reasons why it's, to me, very, very important, the kinds of words that we're using when we're talking about these phenomena. To me, it's much more helpful to talk about what are the patterns of racist discrimination, of sexist discrimination? How does economic and class power get recreated? Many of the systems really, and the people designing them, I think, never give a second thought to things like white supremacy or structural racism or gender discrimination in the kind of data sets, right? What are the patterns of those phenomena in the data sets that they're using? And then, of course, is it even plausible or possible to mitigate those kinds of discriminatory effects in the products and that they're working on, that and the algorithms that they're making. And so I think, there are certain words that have emerged that I guess, if you were asking me about like things that I would change from the book, I would, at the time that I was using words like bias and ethics, again, these were not popular words. These were not, people weren't using them the way they use them now. Now I find those words have been profoundly depoliticized and defanged of things like intersectional power analyses, which is what I was doing in my book, and was using these words in that context instead of saying which I hear from people in Silicon Valley all the time, which is there's all kinds of bias, right? Similar to kind of what you're saying, like, well, there's bias and, that's just what it is. It's like, okay, but I'm not talking about that. I mean, why wouldn't we bias then if we're going to like, let's add more words to words like bias and say, we're going to bias our technology to mitigate structural racism, to create repair right. in society, to undo damage or to do restoration. We actually have to be really specific about what kind of bias is at play, rather than being comfortable that there is a bias and then using that as a way to kind of depoliticize and not take responsibility for what we're actually talking about. And so I think that's been a very difficult dimension of my work. As I talk to computer scientists, for example, is that they kind of are not equipped always to talk about things like structural racism or discrimination. And then they can't locate it. They don't even really know how it's happening. And I'll tell you, just anecdotally, I've talked to people, for example, who worked on the newsfeed algorithm at Facebook years ago. And been in a conversation with them about like, it didn't occur to you that you were enacting housing discrimination in the way in which you were not showing housing ads to people of color. And, it's like their response is, well, people have a right to show the ads they want to show to certain people. I mean, that what's so wrong with that? And I'm like, well, that's against the law. You can't do that. That's what's wrong with it. It's like,
that's what's wrong.
we have civil rights laws, but this logic does not enter into their logics. And this is one of the reasons why it's so extremely important to me to have very nuanced conversations when we're talking about machine learning, for sure.
I do find that technologists, number one, sometimes have a very libertarian mindset of, well, everybody should be able to do anything that they want to, because it just simplifies their decision-making process.
Right.
It's like, well, anything is okay, right? And I see that playing out sometimes when we talk about other forms of structural discrimination in technology fields, like just the small number of people of color and women who are in the fields in the first place. And the philosophy that I sometimes hear is, well, those people could be in the field if they wanted to be. They don't want to be. So why would you make them be? I think it's all a little bit related. The idea that structural racism, well, we could just get rid of that by just building a filter. We'll just filter that out, as though the solution is that simple, when it's really embedded in the fabric of what we're doing. And so you have to understand it at a deeper level. So could you talk some about technology in the context of some of the recent events facing the country, the Black Lives Matter movement that's emerged so much in the last year, the conviction of Derek Chauvin, and some of the other issues that have happened around racial disparities in COVID-19?
Sure. Those are really distinct, but also interrelated issues. I think one of the things that's been important, I just before coming to join this talk, I had the pleasure of listening to both Dana Boyd and Farai Chidea, who is an important journalist. Dana Boyd runs Data and Society and she's a Microsoft Research Network researcher. And we were talking about these very issues. And one of the things that was that is so interesting is, I think, people relate right now to Black Lives Matter, I think, as kind of our modern or contemporary civil rights movement. And indeed it is. Although it's mostly been focused on issues of police brutality and violence against Black people and in some cases Latina people. There's really this kind of distinct focus on extrajudicial violence by the state, police officers, and the courts that don't convict, police officers who kill Black people. So that's been an incredibly important movement. And of course, the internet has played a very important role in helping to mobilize people around Black Lives Matter. In fact, kind of as a hashtag that emerged in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin, all the way through kind of this contemporary moment. So I think, there are a number of opportunities that have emerged with what the internet has made possible. At the same time, those very technologies are weaponized and used to create profound cultures of that uphold white supremacy and make it very, very difficult for us to really have the kind of systemic change that we're looking for. And so this is where I think of, the work of people like Joan Donovan and, of course, researchers at Data and Society, but Harvard Shorenstein Center, and even, some of the work of, people who work in our center at UCLA, Dr. Stacy Wood, about these ecosystems of conspiracy, of blame, of fear and anxiety that, of course, undermine our ability to get fair juries, but also create profound national security threats. And so it was so interesting to listen to people like, journalist Farai Chidea talk about the incredible uptick, for example, of white supremacists in the military, and how this really led to the January 6th, seditious white supremacist uprising against the United States government. How now, from her reporting, she sees up to a third of the U.S. military is engaged in some type of white supremacist, white nationalist, or neo-Nazi kinds of organizing or, rhetoric and language, and are willing to go up against, an attempt to overthrow the United States government rather than see things like a multiracial democracy be enacted in the United States. Those things are really, really challenging and troublesome. And what they underscore is that Black Lives Matter, concerns about addressing racism in our society are not just to the benefit of Black people, but that race and racism constantly get mobilized to create all kinds of social fractures that really are about, working towards things like white statehood in the United States. That's a security issue for more than Black people.
Yeah.
So I think these are the kinds of things that people want to remember, that Black Lives Matter and talking about, anti-Black racism is important for everyone, because race gets mobilized as a way to destroy democracy too. That is also what is happening. And I think that these things are really, really important. With respect to things like COVID-19 and, vaccination, I mean, one of the things that it was disheartening, and I wrote about this last year for NOMA magazine, was how COVID-19 really laid bare how fragile our systems are, our democratic institutions. We saw that during 2020 and really up to the moment, the industry that's made more money than any other industry is the tech industry. And that industry has used things like that we can't be together in person today, which I wish we could be, even though I know it's raining in Boston. Like exploiting those kinds of things for new market opportunities to sell software and hardware and server space and bandwidth, right? So it's really created, while it's on one hand connected us, it's also really exploited and profited profoundly off of this. At the same time, that industry, for the most part, doesn't pay taxes. Yeah. So that weakens our universities. It weakens K through 12 education. It weakens our public health interventions. It weakens our public media, weakens our libraries. All of the kind of democratic institutions that we need so desperately in these times are weakened by this sector that defunds democracy and our democratic institutions by not paying into the system. So I think that's very dangerous. And I, have been writing and thinking about that. This is also an industry that for the most part offshores its profits. So it doesn't reinvest back into our communities despite what, its promises. And, those things to me are also threats to being able to have people trust in public institutions like the media, like education, so that when we say it's really important to get vaccinated, everybody, or everybody should have access to healthcare and to the ability to be immunized, those things are tremendously weakened by this kind of these ecosystem issues. And of course, it's not, this is where the disinformation researchers are so important, because they really help us understand that ecosystem destabilizations makes for the possibility to exploit things like, white supremacy and anti-feminism and anti-trans and anti-woman narratives and politics and anti-Black and Latinx and Indigenous. I mean, it's like death by 1,000 cuts is what's happening more broadly in our kind of national information and knowledge and media infrastructures. And if there were ever a time that I could say that libraries and information scientists and knowledge managers and the kinds of programs and people who do that work should be at the forefront and should be the most funded people, I will say it is now. This is the time. And if this isn't the time, then what are we doing? I mean, doubling down on engineering to me is, it's part of kind of how we got here.
Right. Well, and it's, I think it's discouraging at times in the last few years, especially, but I think to some extent this has always been true, that things that should be kind of universally appreciated and valued, like science and health, become politicized and become wedge issues. And I think that technology, computing and information technologies have so much potential for good. But when they're embedded in systems that are structurally not good and not working in the interest of all people, then those systems, of course, as you said, if you're pursuing a profit, and the way that you pursue a profit in a society that is built on structural racism is to perpetuate structural racism, then of course the profit motive is inherently problematic. And so how do we break all of that down? It's not easy, and it can't just be an engineering solution, and it can't just be a political solution. It really has to be all of those, a lot of different interdisciplinary folks coming together to think about it. So I wanted to turn to a couple of questions that we're starting to get in the chat. So Yules Sundberg asks a great question that I think is very relevant. We've been talking about racism and a little bit about sexism, but we also have major issues right now with a lot of progress towards LGBTQ rights and trans rights, but at the same time, a huge amount of whether you want to call it backlash or just exposing of existing hatred. So Yul says, I've noticed as a trans person that there's an extreme amount of pornification of and bias against trans people in search engines. Is there anyone you know of who's doing work around transphobia in AI and search engines?
Yeah, that's such a great point to make, and it's an important one. And I think that the Algorithmic Justice League, some of their researchers have definitely been thinking about, maybe not so much specifically in search, and search results, but definitely in terms of like what can, transgender imaginaries, right, which are really important in terms of theory, like that we can theorize far beyond the binaries. And, there's a long tradition of feminist science and technology studies scholars who have engaged with like queer theory, for example, to help us understand the limits of binary logics, which are fundamentally kind of at the heart of the way in which we think of programming, many programming languages, right? So, and computing systems and hierarchies, decision trees that are hierarchical. Yeah. So I think that while I don't know and I know there are people, there have to be. I mean, one of the things I know for sure is that almost immediately, as soon as my work started coming out, other people started looking at all kinds of other things that were happening in search. And I'm just getting too old and too removed from the specific papers that are being written, but I know that people are writing about this. And if you don't find it, Yules, I hope you'll write it. We need it to extend the critique and also make visible the harms. It's very, very important that we do that, and we can do that in a lot of different ways. And we'd be happy to support you, writing a white paper with us at UCLA. So I think that that's a great and important point. And of course, again, thinking about the limits of gender binaries, but also that, here's where I think about groups like Feminist AI, which is the group we have a, relationship with, which are made of a lot of, kind of Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, and feminist coders, programmers who are trying to do things like, imagine feminist search. What would that look like? And how would we queer the search engine too? So that work is definitely happening. And I would say check out Feminist AI as well as a community of people to connect with if you're in programming.
I think the Grace Hopper Conference and the Tapia Conference are both places that sometimes have work in these areas. And a couple of references that are coming in the chat are Morgan Klaus Schurman at UC Boulder and Michael Andevito. So those are names
Awesome.
to check out. The next question is from Courtney. I loved your vision for the Imagine engine in your book. Do you have any updates on that project? Dying to use that approach. So I don't know.
Courtney, how do we get everybody in on it? I don't know. I know. Listen, everywhere I go when I'm talking to academic librarians, I'm like, don't you all want to make a public interest search engine? Why aren't we doing this? And, it's hard because sometimes the academic librarians are like, they love Google. They're like, why would we want to take on Google? Or it seems too big and daunting. They're not interested in trying to be competitive. I'm not really trying to get anyone to make a new Google. I'm trying to get people to make many different kinds of search engines, because more search engines is better than one search engine for the most part. Google has like 94% market share, I think, right now. So we don't want that. We don't want a monopoly search engine. But in terms of like technically building it, no, there's no progress. There are people who I think get interested, but it's hard. Now, listen, that doesn't mean that, Lena Khan is about to get confirmed to the Federal Trade Commission. If the FTC and the DOJ are successful in taking on Google in terms of antitrust and breaking up Google and or breaking up Facebook, then that means when you break up a monopoly, then you spin off many different parts of it. And that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, from that process, some redistribution of assets, of Google assets, into the public sphere and into public interest spaces. I'm watching that like a hawk and thinking that could be a place for opportunity. I mean, I know that there are companies who are trying to think about what would it look like to do anti-racist technology making. But, funders are not interested in that yet. So finding the resources to do it. I still believe that whether it's the iSchool Consortium and now I'm looking at you, Simmons. I know, that there could be leadership to inspire collaborative kinds of search that doesn't try to be like Google, but actually tries to be something incredibly different. And maybe we'll see it.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet.
I have a question from one of our faculty, Rong Tang, who asked, what do you think is the leadership or advocacy role for LIS professionals to advocate for DEI, anti-racism, and free and equal access to information, including and beyond the digital technology realm?
Well, I think that LIS schools and programs also have diversity and equity and inclusion problems. I mean, I think when I look out, my back of the envelope math is that there might be a little more than a dozen Black PhDs in information science or library and information science. I know for sure half of us know each other. And then I'm kind of giving, I'm fudging. There might be another 6 or 7 that I don't know. So we know that, in terms of teaching and leadership and research, that the field will continue to have issues of whiteness and its own kind of issues of white supremacy, because when people of color also enter our field, we often don't stay. And this, of course, really happens in terms of practitioners, people with MLIS who go to work in libraries and archives and leave after a few years because they find themselves so profoundly tokenized and also not advancing into leadership that it's just too hard. I still tell my students of color that to work in this field is to be you're integrating it like it's the 1950s. That is truly what it feels like to work in this field. I mean, I know that firsthand from my own career. So that makes it a challenge. Having said that, the possibilities for this field and for information workers of a variety of different types to move to the fore, people who are already oriented around democratic institutions like libraries. I mean, I've loved seeing people tweet out over the last couple of years that, if you were to propose something like a library today, people would think that was the most radical communist idea that has ever, hit this country. So, we're still holding on to these kinds of what I think of still as forming, in progress, democratic experiments around shared knowledge, opening up access to knowledge. Those things are incredibly important for science, for art, for culture, for communities, for literacies of many types. So I think this is the time to triple down on this field and on these kinds of programs and on this kind of training, making it more legible and visible. We're thinking at UCLA about things like, public internet librarianship, because Sarah and I, we have MLISs and we're interested, and obviously we study the internet. Could UCLA and Simmons and some of our other colleagues around the country, could we join forces and get people interested in doing librarianship for the open web? That seems like an amazing new field that we should be inventing, and we're here to help. And it's going to take more than just UCLA to be interested in that. So I think there's so many kinds of possibilities for our work, and this is not the moment for us to step away or defund this kind of work. This is the moment for us to, again, I'm making the appeal to you, to the dean, to understand and help prioritize this, because this is the place where there's a lot of interdisciplinary possibility, in practice, and where we could create many, many more demonstrations of social justice and social justice oriented work.
Thank you so much. Well, I had been planning to ask you if there was one thing you wanted the audience to take away, what would it be? But I think you've just given a really wonderful kind of summation statement, and I know we're at time. So I want to thank you again for being here. I'd like to thank Sonda and Rachel and Colin and everybody who helped to organize this, and all of the audience for joining us today. This has really been a great conversation, and I'm going to take you up on Simmons partnering with UCLA and others to work on these issues.
Awesome. Let's do it. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. And
Thank you.
I'll make sure you get all the questions from the chat that we didn't get a chance to talk about. And maybe you could tweet about some of them.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Naresh?